Hello. Today I'm thinking about metaphors and I'm thinking about what they are and how they can be helpful to us. Um, when I first sat down and I was thinking about metaphors, I asked myself, what is a metaphor and how do I define what it is? And I came to the conclusion that a metaphor is a translation. It's something that we use in everyday speech, but it's not something that we think about all the time. They're connective in nature and they kind of seem to create a web of meaning, or they have these little invisible ropes that connect two seemingly unrelated topics together. A metaphor is a lot like a painter's color palette being dipped into and then applied to the canvas of word. And although metaphors are very flexible and they're very shapeable and shifting and moldable like clay, they oftentimes actually give us a better sense of what something is in a more tangible way. They help us to solidify and understand something more tangibly. This video is going to be in 4 parts. The first part is going to be about how metaphors are a big part of linguistics themselves. The second part of this video is going to be about how metaphors can be useful and helpful in emotional well-being. The third part of the video is going to be about how metaphors are used in magic. And the fourth part of the video is going to be some exercises and ways that I think can be helpful to more consciously and creatively connect with metaphors and use them. Metaphors are laced within the development of linguistics itself. Adjectives are often metaphors, and a lot of the sayings that we use are very metaphorical. So an example of this is saying that someone is intelligent by using the metaphor of light. We do this all the time. We say, she is so brilliant, or we say that book was so illuminating, or that person was very bright. We do this often without consciously thinking of it. We use phrases and idioms such as you hit the nail on the head or something like that. And although we don't actually directly think about what it is that means, we're not actually thinking about a nail or a hammer and something being hit on the head, we know what that means. We kind of translate it right in the moment, but it's a metaphor. And it's a great example of how metaphors are all throughout our speech. We can see in Mandarin Chinese, for example, the etymology of the characters. When we look at them, it's as if there's picture shows that are emerging right out of the characters. Beginning on the cave walls and carved into bones, there are depictions of words. And these words are not always tangible nouns, but sometimes they're non-physical and they describe a concept, a verb, or an adjective, something that you can't place your fingers on. And in order to convey these concepts, these very conceptual words in ancient times, metaphors were indispensable and absolutely necessary for the development of human communication. An example of this is the Chinese word for to grasp or understand, or at least one of the characters for that word. And if you look closely at the picture that they depicted, it is a bird inside of a net. The etymology of metaphor itself is kind of interesting. And if you split the word apart, it's a Greek word, metaphero. And if you look at meta means to change a state or to transfer. And then if you look at the ending, pharaoh, it means to carry or bring or bear. I feel that this is the essence of words and the spirit of logos itself. Being able to hold on to a meaning and express it outwardly into the world. Metaphors signify both a state of change and also holding on to an essence and keeping it. So the essential part of a metaphor or something being held onto is very much like a sacred seed that is kept in an ark, where the other part of the metaphor, the part that is transformative and that is changing state, is something that shifts and molds and grows out of that seed depending on the circumstance. Metaphors are magical, and they help us to communicate more deeply and more creatively with any subject matter. We can use metaphors in a meaningful way and talk to other people and understand the roots and shapes of our emotions. I do this a lot. I bring an emotion that I'm working with into my thoughts, and I see what comes up symbolically and metaphorically. Like, what is it that is surrounding the feeling that I'm having? Once we start approaching an emotion, a difficult emotion, in a creative way, such as describing it with metaphors, this places us in a state of being in charge of it, being more aware of it. It also lets us look at the emotion and perhaps understand it from a new angle, or just maybe you start to see a flavor or shape or arena of life that the metaphor is emerging out of, and then it helps you to understand what the issue is in the first place. Being able to do this, then you can possibly draw it, like make some art out of it, or write a small paragraph describing it, or even naming it. Believe it or not, creating art about the subject matter of our issues is one of the most empowering things that you can do. It's one of the simplest ways to allow yourself to actually feel a feeling thoroughly and completely, while simultaneously taking the reins of responsibility to heal yourself. Being able to see something more clearly and also having a way to talk to others about the issue is wildly helpful. It makes a big difference to be able to describe something and talk to somebody. When we find ourselves in a state of overwhelm due to a strong emotion, we become trapped in the nuance and the emotional waters of our emotions. But if we want to get into a state where we're contemplating them and interacting with them directly and more consciously, and we also don't want to be overwhelmed by them, we can slow everything down with metaphors. At least it's one way to do this. Slowing things down with metaphors is a technique that can be applied over time. There will be times in the heat of the moment where you're going to be unable to slow down and use a metaphor. And only upon reflection will you be able to bring into practice connecting symbolically with your emotions. But over time, I feel like if you do this practice and you come back to checking in with yourself and seeing what the metaphor is when the emotions occur, checking in after that you've had maybe an emotional experience, over time, I feel like brick by brick, you start building something. You start building a fortress or a temple, and slowly but surely you start to be able to understand what it is that is before you and within you, and you can walk into the temple space with ease and peace of mind over time. Metaphors and this kind of a practice can slow down the sensations that you might have and allow for more space, more breath, deeper contemplation, and also just taking a step back and seeing the bigger picture, and also allowing yourself to feel and allowing yourself to check in on yourself. Giving yourself compassion. You might feel that next time you feel overwhelmed, to try and describe it. Sometimes this is very difficult though in the moment, because emotions are they're very unlike facts. They're not something that you can point a finger at or directly shine a light on and understand. They're much more like moving water. But if we can describe them in metaphors, sometimes this can give us a better footing and more solid ground of understanding. If you are a practitioner of magic, chances are that you are already using metaphors quite frequently. In magic, metaphors are used all across the board. One example of this is when we invoke. We are taking in the idea and connecting with a god or goddess, a symbol, or a future self that we aim to reach. When we do this, we are essentially verbally sketching out a description and the essence of whatever it is that we are aiming to become. And we find ourselves describing specific ways that we connect with that symbolism. No one way is correct, but perhaps there is a best way to connect with the symbol via metaphor in that moment that will help us best connect to it personally. When we flip over tarot cards, we are essentially translating the meaning of the picture into applicable and useful information. If we get the Ace of Wands, for instance, it doesn't actually mean that a single stick is going to catch fire in our near future. But what we do in magic is we look at that symbol and we say, okay, this is fire. We're going to translate the fire, the wand, into, what does that mean? Creativity. And so we have a metaphor for fire, and that is creativity and power and energy. And then we look at the ace or one, and we say, okay, the ace or one, the metaphor for that is a beginning or something singular, like the potentiality of a seed. And then what we do is we have a conversation, or an internal conversation if you're doing the reading for yourself, and we have a conversation about the potentiality of your creativity. In the ancient Chinese text, the I Ching, the metaphor of nature and of the elements is used all throughout. One of the symbols, hexagram 63, it shows the elements of water and fire at play. Water is on the top and fire is on the bottom. This symbolizes things being in a state of perfection. Our metaphorical minds can kind of translate this and imagine that if fire were beneath and water was above, that it would kind of be like it would boil the water and cook it. They would interact and it would bring about steam. And this is because the nature of fire itself is to always rise. And the nature of water is always to seek going downward. So we can imagine how and why they would interact. And to the Chinese, this was a state of completion. This is how you wanted things to interact and to be. Conversely, there is a hexagram 64, which is its opposite, and it has water on the bottom and fire on the top. Now, in that arrangement, the opposites go their separate ways and they do not interact. And so it actually represents a state of incompletion. This is just another example of how metaphors are used in magic. And in this specific instance, it begs us to ask the question of what we exalt and what we put on top, and just how impactful the fire of creation is on the emotions of water. Taoist weather magic is no exception to the magic of metaphor. The practitioner of Taoist weather magic aligns themselves with a state of weather in order to walk with the Tao. And if they are seasoned enough, they can impress their own states of energy upon the larger picture of weather. This is all done through metaphor and through the understanding of what each aspect of weather actually and symbolically represents. For instance, thunder. It shocks us, it excites us, it charges us up. And in the Chinese, they say that the essence of thunder is what shakes the buds loose in the springtime. And then from there, things awaken into fullness. It's the very same thing as the English idiom to light a fire under one's ass, or the idea of initiation. We use methods of inquiry in magic, something like scrying, like John Dee and Edward Kelly did in the 1500s, or we use active imagination, like Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist. And in these examples, as well as many others, what we're doing is we're kind of using metaphorical stories to work with. And we create connections both externally and internally in a metaphorical way. There are a couple of exercises that I can think of that would be helpful. They're helpful ways to work with metaphors more consciously and creatively. If it's something you feel like maybe you're struggling with, or you wouldn't be good at doing, or you just want to strengthen your conscious connection with metaphors and with yourself and your life. One way is to pick an object and then describe that object to yourself, and then apply that description to your life. So you can pick an object, something maybe you see around yourself, or something that you are thinking about. It doesn't have to actually be tangibly in front of you. And then let's say I pick a fruit tree. So a tree is a wonderful symbol already, metaphorically, for growth. That's definitely something that is right off the cuff. We can just kind of know. But if I want to go further into this, and maybe I don't have a direct metaphor for the symbol that I pick, I could describe it to myself. And so I could say, what is a fruit tree to myself? Okay, a fruit tree has, a tree in general, or a fruit tree specifically, has roots and a foundation that's reaching down and is grounded. And then the tree grows up in one big, large, sturdy trunk. And then the trunk, the strong trunk branches out into branches. And on those branches is fruit. It bears fruit. Okay, so that is my description of the fruit tree, just very simply and actually. But then I can go one step further and I can say, okay, where in my life do I feel like the fruit tree, or would I like to feel like the fruit tree? How can I apply the description of the fruit tree to my life? Okay, so then I can say, well, maybe financially, or maybe in my relationships, or maybe there is a strong central part of myself, such as my creativity and my art, that is now branching out, and I'm seeing it branch out into other parts of my life, and it's bearing fruit. Interestingly enough, I think that if you do this exercise, and over time, say you were to get the fruit tree or think of the fruit tree again in a year, you might come up with a different metaphor. You might see the fruit tree differently, and you might connect with it differently metaphorically, and that can be very helpful. Okay, way 2 of working with metaphors that I came up with is it's the same exercise as with the objects, only in a less tangible way, where you would be working with something that is more conceptual. So it could be something like concept, like gratitude or forgiveness, or joy, or vibrancy, something like that. And then, or also verbs. So like something like running or relaxing or singing. So we'll just take the example of singing, and basically we're going to do the exact same thing that we did with the objects, where we describe it. So I would describe to myself, what is singing? And so I might say something like, singing is emanating an expression. It is musical. You emanate out of the mouth. It's harmonious, and there's vibrations involved. And then, so once I have a description, I don't usually call it a definition either, by the way, because I think that it's much more fun and interesting to just think of what it is in the moment, how you describe it. So anyways, so you take the description of the concept, in this case, singing, and you say to yourself, how does this apply to your life? Or you can also, I'm going to give you like an alternate way of thinking of this right now, is what does that description, because you're starting to get a little bit more physical with it, where when you describe something, what is the metaphor that you can see? So maybe you go into yourself and you say, when I think of this description that I just said about the vibrations and the emanating out the mouth and the musical, I think of bees, honeybees. I think of honeybees coming out of a flower and buzzing vibrantly in the sunlight. Or, maybe it's a different description. Maybe I close my eyes and I think of it again, and I think about something emanating out of the mouth and the vibrancy of it. And this time I arrive at, I see a sarcophagus, and the top of the sarcophagus is just coming off, and the dust is shaking, and it's moving, and it hasn't moved in thousands of years, and now there's like a new light being shined on something that had been closed for a very long time. So just kind of give you some examples of how different singing could be in any one moment. And I think this is the importance of it, is that the journey of discovering the metaphor is the gold. Metaphors cultivate our conversations. They color it and make our time together more interesting. The development of communication across our globe has been fueled by a furnace of metaphors, and will continue to be just like that over time. When we think about how impactful metaphors are on the globe and from over time, we can easily see the benefit and value of using metaphors more consciously in our personal lives. It's going to help us understand our emotions better. It's going to help us reach to our souls more deeply and to the people around us that we communicate with and that we love and that we share our experience with on earth. So, what metaphors right now are working in your life? Which ones are speaking to you the most? Tell me about them. I want to hear about what metaphors are doing for you. How have metaphors impacted your life? Right now, I am working with two main metaphors. One is the metaphor of an internal metalsmith that is hammering out a relatively stubborn piece of steel into a different desired shape. So share with me in the comments below any thoughts that you have about this. And thank you so much for listening. I hope that something out of this video is helpful for you. And I am wishing you well. Bye.